We are starting assignment 1. We are going to start with sketching some visions. Ideally, we would sketch our vision both in a horizontal format and in a portrait format. And the vision we are sketching is our own idea of what a cool fantasy landscape would be, not trying to match some pre-existing landscape, right? Once we have our sketch, then we take different found objects, found pixels we find from other sites, just like we do with the cartoon jumble, and we arrange them and put them together into a scene, right? And the more time we're able to put into that arrangement, the more thoughtful our composition, the more believable that fantasy landscape might be. We're going to learn how to build our skills in transforming and rotating and adjusting, right? And layering, just like we did in the exercises, but adding to that, adjusting things like opacity and color and edge control and focus and lighting, just to make it all as believable as possible. Right? We are required in this assignment, just like with the cartoon jumble, to have at least 5 different components that we composite together. That is the minimum, right? It's much more likely you'll have closer to 10 components when all is said and done, because things like fog is a component, right? But the reason you need at least 5 is because you want to think of it more like a puzzle of elements, instead of just like you found a really great photo of the Grand Canyon and now you're just going to put stuff on the Grand Canyon like stickers, right? We really want it to be our own composition. And in our composition, we're going to stress trying to have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. 3 layers of depth. So you can see that here nicely labeled. Foreground elements here, middle ground, background. And that's going to give you the most expansive fantasy landscape. All right. So how do we get started? Well, in your sketchbooks, I asked you to write a few things. And I asked for the class to come up with some for the demo. And so we were thinking this would be underwater for my demo this semester. Let me make this a little smaller. We were thinking it's going to be kind of dark. So maybe nighttime, but it's underwater, so it's going to need its own light sources anyway. And then we were thinking the what. What kind of things do I want in this underwater? Well, we want it to feel like it's barren, devoid of typical life. We want it maybe radioactive. So some ideas. We want it to maybe have like rusted debris. I was thinking like what would be interesting would be to have like coral. That was the source of the radiation. That kind of stuff. All right. So the important thing is this starts to give us some search terms for our landscape. So now just right in my sketchbook, I'm going to do a horizontal box. One that's wider than it is tall. And pretty typical. Think kind of a computer screen. Format matters. The size you can print matters, right? And then a portrait format, because I want us to sketch, even though we're only going to make one fantasy landscape, I want us to sketch them both in landscape and portrait format. So portrait format is taller than it is wide. Okay, now with these search terms, before I sketch anything, I need to start finding reference. So I'm going to go to Google, and I'm going to go to images. And I'm going to keep my search terms back here. You can just have your sketchbook open. That's why it's easier to have a sketchbook sometimes than to have to record everything on the screen, right? And in Google Images, I'm going to look for underwater wasteland. That was another term that came up. All right, problem is, can I just use any of these images? Think of the cartoon jumble. No, I have to make sure they have enough pixels to be useful for printing, right? Not just screen resolution, but print resolution. So how many pixels should I have minimum? Yeah, 2000 by 2000. So I can limit them a little bit by going to Tools and going to Size and saying Large. And still I have to look at the pixel dimension, and I'm only looking for ones that are 2000 by 2000. And it's kind of nice and meditative. It makes me actually see them, right? So here's one. One is over 2000, but not really big enough. And it's not anything I need, right? This one is promising, though it's still too small. But it could be a small element. This one is much more promising. So any that are promising, I right-click and I say Open Link in New Tab. Here we go. Nice and big. That's all the dead coral from climate change and the acid in the water. Oh, the other thing I really want to point out, we don't want people in these. These landscapes need to be background plates because we're going to be adding creatures in later. So we don't want anything that feels like it should be moving or living within these landscapes, because that will limit what we can do with them later. We'll be adding those living things in. Now your search terms matter. So I found a few things, but I don't know if they're any good yet, right? So now I'm going to look for some others that I think will be useful elements. Oh, that's cool. That's a good foreground element right there. And you want to have more options than you need. Now you can have signs of life, but you don't want to have living things that we would expect to move in your landscape. So I can have like a little submarine in the background that's rusted out, but I can't have an octopus in my fantasy landscape, right? I would add that in later. Okay, now I'm going to look up, let's see, what else? Rusted shipwreck. And I'm going to actually put sub in there. And just because it's not underwater doesn't mean I can't make it underwater in my work. Again, it's large. But whether it's large enough is always tricky. That one's large enough. And of course we want to avoid any reference that has watermarks all over it. And that's why we're going to look at all of these things closer in their own tabs. And we're going for 3 layers of depth, but in order to do that, we need everything to be, I just love those shapes. We need everything to be, what's the word? Like in sharp focus and usable. Okay, now I'm going to look up, instead of shipwreck, I'm going to look up rusted nautical mines. And again, I'm only looking for the large. And again, stuff that's more than 2000 by 2000 only gets, that's a cool thing, only gets online by mistake. Because there's really no reason for that to be on an internet site. Now, all these skills we could of course use on our own with our own photographs. And so part of this project is we're going to learn a lot about usage rights and what responsibilities we have when we use other people's pixels. But first, we just want to know how to make a good image out of them. That is bizarre. Huh. All right, now I need the coral. It's pretty nice. So I'm choosing quite a few things that are close to 2000 pixels, but it's the ones that are really over 2000 pixels in both dimensions that are going to be my most useful assets. Okay, so now barren coral. That's a nice one. That shows living coral. But that might be where the radiation comes from. Oh, that's a really strong one. And it's hard because if I just looked up a coral reef, I would get a lot of sea life in there, right? And I don't want anything living. I just want the coral. I like the before and after here. That's nice. Then, of course, I'm looking for interesting shapes. Okay, so much stuff. Last thing, oh, those are great shapes. I need kind of the radioactive, so let's see whether they're barrels. I like these that are beaten up. I wish it was a little bit bigger. Ooh, nice. Nice. I can understand why there wouldn't be a lot of photos of nuclear waste barrels underwater. Who's going to go photograph those? But I found some waste sites. Oh, that's really nice. Okay, so now I've looked up about 4 or 5 different terms. Look at all these tabs I have. This is what I do next. I make a folder. I'm going to label this folder Assignment 1, Fantasy Landscape. And I might as well just call it References. Okay. And as I deem one of these good enough, remember I have to open image in a new tab for each one. And then zoom in. That's just not very big. Maybe I'll return to it. But this one is a fish I wouldn't be able to use, but in general, that's the right size. It's decent pixel quality. I can save that and close it. Open image, a new tab, close that tab, zoom in. Yes, some fish I would have to kind of avoid, but I like the open water. Good. Open image, a new tab. There's obviously a scuba diver I wouldn't be able to use. but these shapes are useful. They look ghostly.